Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. Welcome for the roundtable for social renting housing. I want to tell you that today we have a fantastic panel. This is really people who are the best professionals in this area. And I want to thank, first of all, our sponsors who make it possible to invite these professionals of highest level. First of all, Gerald Becker. Gerald, can you stand, please? You're one of the sponsors. And also the company Rostra. Marina, can you please have a sec? Thank you. So we can really invite the best speakers. And I also want, of course, to thank all people who come to our Congress, also from Moscow. And first of all, Nadezhda Kosareva, the president of the Institute of Economy of the city, and also, of course, Andrey Shelkoviy, who is the vice chair of the Russian National Agency for Mortgage Lending. Of course, it will be impossible to do it with our main partners. As you know, in the end of January, we have the roundtable in Moscow organized by World Bank and by the European Economic Commission with the United Nations. So I want to thank and to also welcome Mike Milligan for United Nations Commission, and also one of our main speakers today. And this is Rudy de Jong, the Vice President of Cecodhas Housing Europe, board member of the also Armenian Housing Association. So Rudy is one of the best specialists in the social rental housing and have a great experience of how this business is conducting in the Western Europe. So please let me give a floor to our chair. And I want to tell you that Wolfgang Amann, he is not only the director and associate professor of the Institute for Real Estate, Construction and Housing, but he is also the vice chair and one of the main active consultants and experts in the real estate advisory group with the United Nations. So please welcome Amann. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we have the challenge to wake you up after a lunch break, but I think we have such a challenging topic to discuss. It is indeed something quite new to bring together affordable housing, social housing with the commercial real estate sector. And this is not a coincidence, but we are facing some kind of paradigm shift that social housing is not any longer regarded as a pure public obligation, but it is more and more intervening with the commercial sphere of real estate development. And that is the reason why on an international real estate conference, social housing became a topic. It is not anymore a contradiction, but social housing is an integrative part of real estate markets. And that is actually the focus of our discussion today. In this respect, I would like to invite our first presenter, Rudy de Jong, for his presentation, Social, Public and Cooperative Housing, a European Perspective. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I hope that my presentation will appear on the screen as well. That's the wrong one. This one is probably better, but... Okay, let me start hoping that the presentation will appear. Let me start by thanking you all for being here. Audience of mainly commercial enterprises in real estate. Ah, that's the right one. To invite somebody, representatives of the social housing sector, to be here and to make clear indeed what Wolfgang Amann just said, that we should consider social housing as an important part of the real estate market, especially in times of financial problems, financial crisis. Okay, let me start by introducing let's see if this one works. Yes, by introducing the organization I represent here today, with the difficult name Cecodhas Housing Europe. It's a sort of federation of federations. It's a European Union federation of social housing organizations, national organizations on social housing, public housing and cooperative housing. And altogether, there are about more than 40,000 organizations, social, public, cooperative organizations in these EU member states, and they manage altogether about 27 million dwellings, rental dwellings. And that makes a sort of total of 12% of the total housing stock in the European Union. So that's quite a lot. And what I would like to start with is taking away a few misunderstandings about social housing, public housing, and I will come back later on the difference between these kind of tenures. And the first misunderstanding is often then when we think of home ownership, we think of more wealthy people. And if we think about the rental sector, or more important, social rental sector, we think about poor communities, people with little money. But if you look to this first chart, I don't know if you can read it from where you are sitting now. You see the EU countries on the bottom. And this is a chart of tenure. The blue bars is owner-occupied. So you see on the right countries with a very low percentage of owner-occupied dwellings. The red one, the dark red one, is private rent. The green is social rent. And the yellow, orange one is cooperatives. And then what you would expect is that more wealthy, richer countries would have a big amount of home ownership in the countries. But it's the opposite. If you look to the EU countries, the more prosperous countries have a lower percentage of home ownership, have a bigger rental sector, and quite often a much bigger social rental housing sector. For example, the Netherlands, you see it here on the right. It's not exactly a poor country, but has the biggest social housing sector in Europe, and maybe even in the world. But also other very, prosperous countries like Sweden, Germany, Denmark have a very big rental sector. So you could even say the richer the country in Europe, the more rental housing. And that's not what everybody expects. Secondly, the second misunderstanding has to do with the opinion that rental housing, especially social rental housing, is cheap housing, low-cost housing, because it's meant for people with lower incomes. And home ownership is more expensive. And what you also would think is that poorer countries would have higher costs, higher living costs, housing costs. This chart is about housing costs, the share of housing costs as a percentage of disposable income. So it's not just mortgage or just rent, it's also other expenditure like energy costs. It's all connected housing costs as a percentage of disposable income. And then the red arrow there, that's the Netherlands again, the country where I'm coming from. Then you can see that there's hardly any correlation. There's hardly any correlation between housing costs and how rich or how poor a country is. You can see a rich country on the right, Denmark, very high housing costs, and Luxembourg on the other end, rich country, but quite low housing costs. And countries from Eastern Europe, for example, you can find them all over this chart. There's no direct relation between housing costs and the wealth of a country. So that was the second misunderstanding. Thirdly, this is what everybody expects, much more, I think. This is a chart of overcrowding rate. That means how many people are living in a home, and do they consider their home their household being overcrowded, too many people on a small place. And here you see exactly what you would expect, I think, that the countries in Eastern Europe, they have high percentages of overcrowding rates. And to explain a little bit more, the blue bars is a total, and the red bars are a bit higher, or sometimes much higher. And that's the part of the population, the poorer part of the population below or at risk of poverty. But then, this is what you would expect. Countries in Eastern Europe on the left-hand side, and richer countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Finland, Luxembourg, Germany, on the right-hand side. But if you compare this one with the last slide, where I draw the conclusion that there is no real correlation between housing costs and the wealth of a country, then you should say here that overcrowding rate has something to do with quality. And there's another one about quality. Maybe I should show this one first. This is about the depreciation, housing depreciation, considered by the people themselves. So that means, how do people consider their own housing condition? Technical, but also socially, environmental, etc. And there you see also what you expect, that in the dark-colored countries, on the eastern part of Europe mainly, people consider their homes at a far poorer quality than in Northern Europe and in Western Europe. That's what you would expect. But if I said that there is no relation between housing costs and the wealth of a country, and you look to these charts, then you could say there is no real relationship between housing costs and overcrowding rate and quality of the house. And that is strange. We do not expect this. We do expect that in a poor country, housing costs are high and that overcrowding rates are high, and that's mainly for poorer countries. But it's not true. It's not true. Housing costs can be low in a rich country and it can be high in a poor country. It can be the opposite. There's no clear relationship between different tenures and different countries. It has much to do, of course, with government policies, with economic government policies. I will tell you now something about the history of social housing. And I will also make some comparison with the Russian, with Eastern European situation, and also with other countries in the world who are working on social housing. A short history. It all started, and I speak about Western Europe, Northern Europe, Western Europe. It all started in the 19th century, a period of industrial revolution with high migration figures, people coming from agricultural world to urban regions, overcrowding in the cities, poor housing, low quality, health problems, etc. That was the first start, mainly for private organizations, enterprises, who needed good quality housing for the people who came there to work for them. And they need healthy people. So it was the most important period when social housing started all over Europe. The second important, afterwards, the first half of the 20th century, step by step, we developed in Western Europe welfare states. That meant that governments made themselves more and more responsible for social welfare. It's housing, but also health, education, everything. So the welfare state development started in the first part of the 20th century. And part of this welfare state development was legislation on housing, quality of housing, and subsidies. Subsidies started in the first half of the 20th century, subsidizing housing for lower income people in many European countries. And as a result of this, many social housing organizations came up in many countries. After the Second World War, there was another very fast growing social housing period. Because of housing shortages, of course, and there was a lack of capital. And very important, shortly after Second World War, the equality was pretty high all over Europe because everybody was poor. Nobody had much money. And this is also an important condition for social housing production. If everybody has very low income, there's very little, normally very little investment capital available. So very mass social housing in many countries in the 60s and 70s, and a further development of welfare state arrangements in these countries. And social housing was part of this welfare state development. And only the last, say, 10, 20 years, things are changing again. And that has to do, of course, with the financial crisis, but it has also to do with the decrease of population growth. It goes down, so the demand is lower than it used to be. And what we see almost everywhere is a sort of review of welfare state arrangements, and that has a lot to do with global competition, of course. Europe must become more competitive, and then we think that welfare state arrangements might be too expensive. But the conclusion you can draw here for other countries is that what you see happening in periods of fast economic growth, you would expect maybe that home ownership would grow because of the income of people is growing, so more people can own their own home. But it's the opposite. What we call the flexibility, or the, how do you call it, of the market, of the supply in the market, is not as fast, not fast enough to answer the demand. You have a high demand of people going to work in the cities, pretty low income, and there is no supply from the market normally. And these kind of periods, fast-growing economies, then you see mass production of social housing. What do you see now in China? I think they build 5 million social homes a year. And that's almost, I think, 1/5 or so of what we have in Europe. That's enormous. In many other countries, when the economy is growing, Russia, I think, is a good example, high demand of this kind of production of social public housing. And it is the history of Europe, in fact. And now I would like to tell you something about tenures, because I spoke about public housing, social housing, home ownership. And often in our discussions, we have a feeling about what social housing is. And we compare it with home ownership. And sometimes we say something about rental and ownership. But the experience in Europe is that there is much between plain home ownership and plain social or public rental. So I would very briefly explain here what kind of tenures there are in Europe. And they are not just outright examples, because there are many, many mixtures of different sorts of tenures. First of all, as you all know, home ownership, and there are sometimes in many countries subsidies available or advantages available for all these kinds of tenures. It's not just social rental who gets subsidies. In many countries, commercial rental or even commercial home ownership could get subsidies to get this supply in place. Home ownership, that's what we all know. Condominiums, important in many, many countries, is a form of home ownership, collective home ownership, more or less. You own your own apartment, but all the public places inside the buildings, but also quite often around the buildings, are owned by all the people who live there. Sort of intermediary between public housing and private home ownership. We know cooperative housing, very important in some Eastern European countries, in some Nordic countries, like Sweden. Sweden cooperative housing is big. In Czech Republic, I think it's about 20-25% or so. It's big. In Poland, it's big. Cooperative housing looks a bit like condominiums. It can be very close to condominiums. Condominiums, everybody is the owner of his own apartment. In a cooperative, you own all together.
Rudy, 2 minutes, please.
Okay, I will speed up. That's cooperative housing. Rental housing, just ordinary rental housing, you must know it, I'm sure. Public rental housing means that it's owned normally and governed by the state or the municipality. It's quite important in many countries, and it's a history, of course, of Eastern Europe. And then finally, what I want to say a bit more about is a not-for-profit social rental housing. Not-for-profit social rental housing, privately owned. It's a private organization, NGO organization, who owns it. And there is no profit distribution, or very limited. It's private capital and managed by a not-for-profit company. Often there is public support, but not always. And there is specific legislation in place. Very shortly about the business case of social housing, because we all think social housing is loss-giving. Look at the right hand, I won't explain the rest. Look at the right hand, these are figures, return on investment of residential real estate. It's an IPD figures, that's a global index of real estate performance. On the right hand, property, and you see here on the right hand bottom part, figures in Europe about 6.5% total rate of return on residential real estate since 10 years. Two figures are especially interesting. And that's the white one over there, Germany. Germany does not have a separate social housing sector. It's in fact all commercial, although a part of the commercial sector is being subsidized directly by the government just to subsidize affordable housing at a certain period. And compare it with the Netherlands, because that's the Netherlands social housing. That's the only social housing sector which is part of this IPD benchmark, international benchmark. They are fully comparable. And there you can see that normally 6.5%, 7% is a normal percentage in the last 10 years for a return on investment in residential real estate. In Germany, it was only 3%. Commercial, 10 years long, 3% only. And the social real estate in the Netherlands, social housing real estate, is higher than the average in Germany. There is a business case if you organize it well in social housing. It's not just a loss-giving, long-term. In the Netherlands, to be clear, there's no subsidy anymore. Since 15 years, there's no subsidy anymore. And I will explain you, last chart, Chair, what are the conditions, at least in my opinion, for a successful, affordable, sustainable social housing sector. Because the need in many countries is quite clear. European long-term experience learn that we can have this sustainable system, but we need conditions, important conditions for everywhere. We need a really long-term public commitment, not just a few years subsidy that won't work. Long-term commitment. And and we need some legislation about minimal living standards for people. If people don't have anything to pay, you cannot create any sector, real estate sector. That's clear. It's an open door, more or less. And what is necessary that public legislation and the regulation guarantee good investment conditions. Well, maybe it's also an open door, but it's for every investor. You need a very stable environment to put your investments in. Also for social housing. Without a stable environment, social housing can never be successful in the long run. And I think the last one on the first point is really vital for social housing. You need a revolving fund, as we call it. That means a fund, an amount of money, put apart from the greedy hands of the government and greedy hands of commercial enterprises, a long-term fund which you can use year after year after year for reinvestment. You start with the first investment, you pay back the loan, and then you have the equity in your own property, and you can reuse it as a collateral, you can sell it, you can start again with creating social housing. This fund, sustainable fund, long-term fund, revolving fund, is a necessity for a stable social housing sector. And what can be, I'll really finish then, what can be the most, well, what we think is the most successful model, in fact, for social housing? Because there are many, as I explained. We think that most resilient, maybe we should say this, most resilient because it has to survive in different and difficult periods, not just in successful periods. You need organizations with, of course, a long-term and not-for-profit objective, not getting the money out when you're successful. And you need independent surveillance. That's the role of the government. Independent surveillance that they are doing their job well. And this must be a sector that does not just house poor people. Nobody can house poor people and have a decent return on investment. So you need a certain part of the population, lower income people, lower middle income people, at least. But it also means that you need professional organizations, well-run, cost-effective, but also on a cost-based system. They don't have shareholders. They don't have to pay dividends to the shareholders. So that's the difference. This 2-3% in return, you don't have to pay to your shareholder. So you can invest it in your own property. And finally, where we use the capacity.
Руди, вы завершаете в третий раз уже.
This is the third time you are finishing your presentation.
The people that live in our homes, they have some money to pay. They have some money to invest, and we use them as much as we can. Well, I'm sorry for too much time, but I really appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.
Мы так жестко следим за регламентом не потому, что считаем, что наши спикеры много говорят. Мы хотим как можно больше информации.
We're so strict about time, not because we believe our speakers talk too much, but we would like to put as much information into 1 unit of time as possible. And now we're going to have a very short bridge in between the pan-European view and the typically Russian perspective. There will be a very short presentation lasting only 1 minute. Please. We have heard a very concise overview of European rental housing, social housing. What I learned from this is that there is no cookie-cutter approach to this. There are different practices. Well, this is a typical St. Petersburg family living on Petrograd side in an old part of the city, in an old building built over 100 years ago. This house has officially been recognized by the district committee as habitable. This room houses 3 people, the mother, her daughter, adult daughter, who works, and her son also. The young girl in the middle, Ivana, she earns about 30,000 rubles monthly. That's average wages in St. Petersburg. The mother has a pension of about 8,000 rubles, which also corresponds to the average across Russia. The habitable living area is 9 square meters. The total area of the flat is 16 square meters. Well, of course, they are on the waiting list for improved housing, for housing improvement, but they were put there some 30 years ago in 1981. Over the last 10 years, they have not seen any progress with their waiting process. They are not eligible to any housing benefits, direct housing benefits. They cannot obtain mortgage. Nobody's going to give it to them. They cannot sell this type of housing. This is a building which has 4 apartments. 2 of them have been bought by an investor. Another apartment accommodates people that are very difficult to find and cannot be identified, and their apartment is the 4th. What can the city hall offer to such people, to such dwellers? We talked to Anna Belanina several times, and the only option that we arrived at was to become part of a social renting scheme. So let us see how this can be implemented in practice. What can we do for this family? What are the options on the table for this particular family out of the options that were listed by the previous speaker? How will the government react to this situation? Where will the investors how will the investors be able to provide long-term funding? What world practices will be of use here? Please close this presentation. It's a sight for sore eyes, indeed. But you can make some interior renovations because they don't respect their own housing. They don't really even renovate it a little bit for themselves. This is a privatized apartment, so I think from this year on they will have to bear 30% of the capital repair costs. I don't know if this is going to bring about any progress in their condition. Nadezhda, we are making a transition to the Russian perspective, so it's your turn to speak. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dear colleagues, if you allow me, I would like to make a presentation too. Let me show you some slides here. Yes, indeed, this is a highly pertinent subject for Russia today. Today, the development of rental housing stock in the European sense of the word, or social housing, as they say in Europe, is a very relevant topic. In my presentation, I'm going to use the term social housing without going into the interpretation differences between the Russian term and the corresponding European term. Let me talk about the status of the housing stock in Russia these days. Russia experienced a wave of housing privatization, as a result of which 86% of the housing stock is privately owned. But citizens only own privately 82% of the total housing stock. About two-thirds of this private stock, private housing, is located in multi-apartment flats, and the rest is one-family homes, one-family houses. As far as municipal housing is concerned, or public housing as they would call it in Europe, that accounts for about 14% of all housing. These are living spaces that were not privatized. At the same time, our apartment complexes, which, just as I said, are about 80% owned privately by citizens, fall into the category of condominiums that were so well described by the previous speaker. Let us compare the structure of the housing stock between different countries in terms of their tenure. And if we compare to Russia, we will see that rental housing stands at about 26.5% of the total housing stock. Just as I said, 14% of that is public housing, and 11% comprises separately standing houses or apartment blocks which are rented out by citizens to other citizens in a rather shady grey market. And about 70%, as I said, accommodates owners. We understand that we have fallen into a trap. Free of charge privatization of housing, of homes, has led to a situation whereby most of our apartment blocks are condominiums. And if we look at the Dutch experience, which has been described, we will see that apartment blocks mainly comprise rental housing. It's a different situation in Russia, and this is as a result of this wave of free of charge privatization. We have fallen into a managerial trap. We don't know how to best manage these condominiums, how to reconcile the interests of so many owners in one apartment block. To support what Rudy just said, I would like to show you this. In different European countries, housing management and home ownership and tenures are totally different. They come in different varieties. Don't even look at this overpopulated table too closely. It's just to illustrate the variety of forms that can be used: private housing, municipal, not-for-profit, commercial housing, and so on and so forth. International experience equips us with so many different options. So for us, the task is to assess the situation we find ourselves in and choose the best option or range of options that work the best for us. So what are the peculiarities of the situation in Russia? One, just as I said, mass privatization of housing free of charge. Throughout all these years, the focus was on home ownership. As a result, the population's preferences have shifted. People favor home ownership. A Russian without, if they're not a homeowner, consider themselves homeless. This is our mentality. We have very underdeveloped lending mechanisms. So developers only rely on cash contributions of citizens. If you have some disposable income that you can spare, that you can contribute, fine. Otherwise, no development takes place. There are a lot of shady deals in the rental market. Taxes are not paid. So in the rental sector, we see three groups of lessors: people who have privatized their flats, people who hold social homes, social housing, and then also people who invested into an apartment with the purpose of reselling that apartment later on. It's very difficult to compete with this semi-legal sector if you're a law-abiding investor. It's very difficult. It's almost impossible to compete with this situation. Besides the economic issues, we also have some legislative issues. Our legislation is very concise when it talks about rental housing. There is something about it in the Civil Code, and the Housing Code only focuses on social lease conditions. That is rental housing from municipalities. Not-for-profit housing is not described there. So what are our proposals? We have several proposals here. First of all, Russia is completely overhauling its civil legislation. The first version of the first reading of the new civil code has been passed in the Duma very soon. The two other readings will be completed, and the new code will contain principal new provisions. We would like the new civil code to provide for a better regulation of social rent. Special focus should be on long-term social rent contracts. Then we also need to refine the notion of a rental house, a multi-apartment rental house. Another thing that should not be ignored is this. You see, in Russia we have the civil code on the one hand and the housing code on the other. So in the housing code we would like better provisions relating to the not-for-profit social housing organizations, foundations, and so on. The law should also provide for the opportunity for municipalities to offer subsidies to citizens for rental housing. We also need to sort out the situation with tax benefits. I'm not a believer in tax benefits. However, at least we need to create a tax parity between the lessors and the lessees, because for individuals who own property, homes, there are a lot of tax benefits available now. I guess we need to take out of the shade individual rent. That is when individuals, homeowners, act as lessors. And we also need to provide for certain tax benefits for developers and probably for investors, as well as tax benefits in terms of property tax, discounts to organizations that introduce not-for-profit social housing. Then another interesting opportunity would be an imputed income tax. This is one idea which can be played with also. The land code should incorporate a preferential land allocation for not-for-profit social housing, an obligation should be imposed to register lease and rental contracts. We had a task force that included different stakeholders. In our work, we looked at the various options that are available and how these options can be incorporated into legislation. I'm not going to look at each and every option and model here. Let me just say that construction at the expense of direct investors is not something that we believe in. The economics of this will not work. However, some collective group investments can be pooled, and this might be a viable idea. I think IEJK could also elaborate on this, the next speaker. As far as the commercial sector is concerned, as a first step, we should rely on the municipalities in the first place to create those not-for-profit foundations and organizations. I'm wrapping up now. How are these ideas going to impact the general housing situation in the country? Because we've seen a horrible story just now, and such stories abound, really. How are we going to change the situation around? There is a parameter that we use, that is the proportion of families that can afford to buy 54 square meters of housing. In 2008, there were 23% of such families. In 2011, it changed. You see, Rodstad has really sort of revolutionized the situation this year. So together with our colleagues from AHML, we find it difficult to interpret this radical change in statistical data, because they're providing a figure of 35%. We don't believe in this, but if you go by the indexes that they say that they use also, you can arrive at the figure 27%. By 2030, we would like to have 60%. So the typical family that you described cannot really afford a 54 square meter apartment. Today, however, in my opinion, they could probably take out a loan in order to renovate their existing apartment, and that would somehow change their situation and improve their living conditions. But again, the idea is to take care of such families by 2030. Of course, you cannot rely on mortgage and home ownership only to achieve the 60% threshold. And this is why we need not-for-profit social housing stock that will be available to middle-income families as well as low to middle-income families. And let me give you two more figures here in my last slide. Unlike European countries, you can look at this figure here. It seems that in terms of the number of housing units per household, we're faring pretty well. It's somewhere around 1 in this country. However, in terms of square meters per capita, we have twice as less. In terms of rooms per capita, it's also somewhat inferior. However, home ownership is growing, affordability is growing, mortgage is growing in Russia. So if we yes, it's growing, it's going up really. And if we add not-for-profit social housing into the formula, then we can make the forecast that I'm showing you here. By 2030, we might be able to arrive at 32 square meters per capita, which will be rather close to the European averages. Thank you very much.
Коллеги, мы накапливаем вопросы.
Dear colleagues, we keep accumulating different questions, and they can be asked after all the presentations. I do agree that incomes are going up and affordability is changing also. However, Mr. Putin, about 2 years ago, in one of the program documents, said that by 2011, the cost of housing should decrease by 20%, but mortgage availability should increase. I don't really understand how this can be provided. I don't think our experts can provide an answer here. You need really a surge in construction all over the country, but how can this be achieved? Perhaps my colleague here who represents the government could shed some light on this thinking. Good afternoon. I will also try to be brief and only highlight the main points. Let me talk a little bit about my agency. The Mortgage Housing Agency has been in existence for about 15 years already. Our only shareholder is the government of the Russian Federation. So throughout this long history of the agency, our focus has always been on jump-starting the mortgage market in Russia. Indeed, we recognize that as compared to some of the Western countries, the mortgage market here is still in its infancy, or it's very young, really. So we try to draw on the best practices that have been developed in other places. However, we have been exploring a few new avenues of work lately at the agency, trying to provide new housing options. The previous speaker has made a very comprehensive overview of the challenges we are facing. And because now we are focusing only on Russia only, I will try to add some information, but I'm not going to repeat what the previous speaker said already. Yes, indeed, the grey market, the shady market for rent is still in existence. It's very big, and it is eclipsing a lot of financial flows. Another issue is a lack of legislative regulation in some areas, which precludes investment into housing and which stands in the way of housing development. Yes, we do have some statistics which seems to demonstrate that housing purchases, buying a house, is unaffordable for most of the population currently. One of the targets that we have has already been described. This is a goal that we're moving towards. 60% of the population should have access to housing options. However, this should not necessarily be home ownership or mortgage or acquisition of housing property. Again, we're talking here about a diversity of different tenures and forms, such as commercial rent, social rent, and others. This multitude of options will hopefully enable low to middle income families to address their housing needs. Again, this shouldn't necessarily be home ownership. There is a lot of programmatic thrust that is being accorded by the government to this priority. Again, at various departmental, interdepartmental meetings, you hear about this. A number of directives have been issued in 2012, for instance, by the President. On the 14th of February, the President issued a directive to develop a set of comprehensive measures in order to develop the rental housing market, in order to address the bottlenecks that have been described already, protection of lessees' rights, special regulations and special provisions for waiting list citizens who are on the waiting list. Again, the situation was very vividly described to us. However, I don't quite understand why is it that these people with an average income can not just go ahead and try to make the place where they have to live a little bit more comfortable in terms of its interior? Why don't they take care of themselves, which they obviously can afford to some extent? We're also talking here about improvement of the tax regime as well as regulation of various organizations' activities, organizations that provide housing under different conditions. The directive envisions the development of a set of proposals by September 2012. This policy has also been reflected in a presidential decree, one of the first presidential decrees that to be signed by President Putin on the 7th of May. The decree was signed. Again, this decree incorporates all these different priorities. It sort of, codifies, lays down these targets in a presidential decree. The decree is much more elaborate in terms of what the government is expected to do. It is charged with developing a procedure for free-of-charge land allocation for housing construction of economy class with certain price caps imposed for certain categories of citizens in need of better housing. Special mortgage schemes should be elaborated for various categories of citizens, and another priority is namely to develop social housing for low-income families is also reflected in this proposal. What is our contribution to this process? Well, of course, we are participating directly in the preparation of these different proposals. And a very special role belongs to the Institute of Urban Economics. We have an agreement with them to work together on developing this set of measures. Let me talk a little bit about the limited practical experience that we have. Again, this is not an integrated, comprehensive solution to the problem. This is just a pilot which helps us to trial this approach, even in the conditions of an inferior legal framework and inferior substandard regulation. We're talking about a long-term financing tool, a mortgage scheme for a legal entity that owns these homes. This is a long-term loan for 20 years. This is the period of time within which these projects of this kind can pay back. This pilot project was implemented in the city of Novosibirsk. They constructed 3 low-rise apartment blocks for rent. And again, this work was started as a commercial rental project. Again, this is still in accordance with the existing legal framework. No new provisions are still in force. They're still pending. But even here, very early on, we tried to pilot some of the measures, some of the mechanisms that we believe have potential and that are planned to be included into these regulatory improvements. This project is a joint initiative together with the Novosibirsk regional government. A lot of support has been provided from the regional government, by the regional government, because they took care of the engineering infrastructure and the utilities. The local legislature is currently considering provision of tax benefits in the amount of some 2.2%. Property tax reduction, again, it's within the purview of the region. It's within their jurisdiction. They are in a position to provide that tax benefit to entities that act as lessors. Another idea that is currently discussed but still pending is to provide subsidies to such schemes. about half of the apartments in these houses will be provided to employees of government organizations. Half of their rent will be some of their rents will be subsidized. The other half of the tenants will be employees of an industrial enterprise, and their employer, the enterprise, will be providing subsidies to those employers in whom they see potential, whom they would like to retain. They're going to cover up to 25% of the rent. This is not shown in the slide, but let me give you some more figures. In terms of the costs, the size of rent, we have here a mechanism where the rent is about 20% below the market average. We went to that place and we saw it for ourselves. We saw those apartments. Of course, these are not really premium or luxury apartments, but they have very good amenities. They are well planned out. They are quite livable, quite habitable. In about 10 days from now, the first house will be commissioned. Those apartments will be furnished, fully furnished, and equipped with all the necessary facilities. What we're doing currently is we are putting together a portfolio of project proposals for the future. From our experience, we can say that there are two types of customers that we can serve. One type of customer is regional administrations, regional governments from various parts of Russia. They would like to use these schemes and mechanisms to develop rental housing markets in those regions in order to take care of the housing needs of low-income families and government employees, employees of government companies. And another type of customer that we see is military and industrial complex enterprises, the military industry that needs a lot of skilled employees, a lot of skilled workforce, and they want to have some incentives to retain them. Based on our cooperation with the military companies, I can say that some of their plans include to recruit at least 2,000 to 3,000 new employees to each military enterprise. And this is really a lot. And they need a lot of incentives. But overall, one of our tasks is also to assess the existing needs and the existing demand. The project proposals that we are currently considering are not project proposals that have to do anything with commercial terms or market values. Again, we work for social causes here. I tried to be brief, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Andrey.
I would like to pay attention of the participants that in Mr. Shelkovy's presentation contained the most recent, most current examples of the interactions between the government and developers, and the Kaluga and Novosibirsk experience. This is something that is happening today, and we can see this format developing as we speak. The employers are the initiators of such models. So it is all about the mobility of personnel. It's not the government that initiates such models. In our next presentation, Mr. Green, you also have 10 to 12 minutes. Dear colleagues, we will probably be late 10 or 15 minutes so that we could hear all the speakers. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I represent the National Agency for the Development of Housing Stock, Social and Commercial Housing. Our foreign colleagues talked about the large share of rented housing in Western countries. And I talked to Mr. Romanenko, and we thought that the richer the country is, the bigger share of rented housing you can find in the overall stock. And this is all true because we saw the slide to that effect. So indeed, we have now to discuss what needs to be done in order to get close to these figures. I think we need to incorporate and follow the experience of Western countries. We can see that in Germany, for instance, municipalities play a very active role in initiating social housing, and developers are very well protected. We also know that the citizens are very well protected because there is a certain term that people cannot sell this housing during 15 years. This slide shows you the share of rented housing in Finland, which is very close to St. Petersburg. As you can see, the share of rental housing is 28% at this time. In France, it is approximately 40%. And as you can see, the graph is going upwards. The curve is going upwards. And I think this correlates with the fact that the financial crisis hit a lot of countries in Europe. And we can see that the rental housing is becoming very attractive to investors. Here you can see some statistics on the income in the US. There are several groups, and there's also distribution by the family status. We hear a lot of discussions about what is needed in order to launch a similar model in Russia. And since we know that this World Congress of FIABCI is a very authoritative platform, I hope that both Mr. Amann and our colleagues will help us become part of this global trend. The previous speaker showed the importance of social rental housing for the government, for the state, and every week we hear the Russian president or the Prime Minister of Russia saying something about housing. Let me also mention that on the 7th of May, the new president was inaugurated, and on the same day, President Putin signed a decree on the housing strategy, and it mentioned rental housing as well. I think we need to be proactive here, and we invite our foreign experts, foreign colleagues to take part in this process. On the 18th of May, the Russian Duma will hold the first meeting of the Committee on the Implementation of Social Rental Housing in Russia. This slide shows that society will definitely benefit from the growth in rental housing. It will improve the quality of life and quality of housing. And you may remember the slides with unbearable photographs of the living conditions that some people live in. But at the same time, you have to remember that if you analyze the number of housing, the amount of housing commissioned over the past 10 years, you will see that we have approximately 80 square meters per person. And we can see that there's a lot of housing being commissioned, but there's very little social subsidized housing. And I think we need a government policy that would help us here. Housing market should also be well structured. I'm sure that rental housing should not be limited to high-rises. There should be low-story buildings, there should be single-family homes. And as Mr. Sharapov, who spoke before me, who is a very well-known expert in this area, we hope that such experts will be part of the expert committee. Elena Nikolaeva, deputy head of the Committee on Housing Policy of the State Duma, is part of the special group. We also have Mr. Grachov, who is the author of the mortgage law. We have deputies from the regional assemblies, from the Moscow Duma, from Saratov Regional Duma, and representatives of other regions. So we have a lot of people from the regions participating in this work. A very significant milestone has been reached. We have already held a tripartite meeting with the involvement of trade unions, government, and employers. And we were able to develop a set of measures to alleviate the situation with housing. This was done only in one region, but we can see that employers are ready to provide their personnel with housing by subsidizing housing, by introducing other incentives. Another important point is that the government-run organizations, the people who work for the government, can also get subsidies. We hear a lot about corruption in this sphere, but in order to fight corruption in the government sphere, we need to improve the living conditions of government workers. And I think that good housing, the provision of housing, will be one incentive that would become a barrier to corruption. The agency initiated this program. Unfortunately, our legal expert, Mr. Lebedev, has just left the room because he is the one who is working on the legislation right now, on the amendments to the legislation. And thank you for letting us participate in this forum. It is important to let all the experts know about our problems. Thank you for your very interesting presentations as well. Thank you for your attention. Ladies and gentlemen, and now you will have an opportunity to ask questions to the speakers, and then we will have a panel discussion. And then Wolfgang will be the last to speak at the very end. I have to answer the question that was raised here several times. I did not want to show to you that some people live in unbearable conditions. It is an average family in St. Petersburg. How do you know it's an average family? Well, it's an average income. Petrogradskaya is a very prestigious area, and there are a lot of people living in such conditions. I didn't even ask the question, why is it that they cannot repair their own apartment? But they live at the very last floor. Every year they make some repairs. And we didn't take the wallpaper off just to make pictures. I told them we were coming a day before we came. If I wanted to show you unbearable conditions, I would show you wooden houses with sanitary facilities outside the houses. There are people living in much worse conditions. I just wanted to show to you that an average family in St. Petersburg that finds itself in a difficult situation does not have a legal way out of their housing situation. And rental housing, social rental housing, could alleviate their situation. However, 500 units that were offered by the city is not enough. I think it is important for us to formulate the first step. We know that there are a lot of different government initiatives, there are a lot of Western models that we could follow, but what is the first step? What should we do in terms of making the first step? Do we want to wait for other initiatives? Do we want for the government to act? This is going to take decades. What measures do you think would be most efficient in this respect? I think now we can open the floor to discussion. Is there a roving mic in the audience? Please speak in the microphone. 1, 2, 3. I think it would be interesting to hear more about the various examples that we have in Russia, even though we have this legislation that we all know about. Even in the current conditions, we have some examples, good examples. For example, the Rostro company has built some social housing. There are companies who have already started such projects. They didn't wait for the new legislation to be passed. Please pass the mic to other people who wanted to ask questions. I represent the Rostro company. Unfortunately, our president was not able to be here. Should I speak into the mic? Right, so I would like to give you an idea of what he wanted to speak about. I wanted to tell you about our experience of building in rental house in Kingisepp in Leningrad Oblast, just outside St. Petersburg. Even though it was there's very little experience in investing into such houses, our experience turns to be very successful. We were able to fill it within 2 weeks. This kind of a house is an apartment building. It has apartments to be rented out. We've been talking about the need for such houses for a long time, but usually investors are reluctant to invest into such kind of projects because they feel that it is going to be a long time before they actually break even. Usually, it is very costly to maintain such buildings. In our project, we decided to use energy efficiency Velex system. We built a house where 1 square meter was 19,000 rubles. And it turned out that we saved approximately 40% on heating alone. The Velex technology made it possible to maintain the house, the building, very cheaply, and that shows that it was rather profitable to build such buildings. We built this house on the Ivanova Street in Kingisepp. This is the first experience of building such a house, which is not only a rental house, but it's also an energy-efficient house. Rostra built it with its own funds, and the apartments were for commercial rent. The administration of the district decided to rent out 8 apartments so that they could be sub-rented to the groups of population who find themselves in special needs. These were subsidized. This is an example of a very successful public-private partnership. We continue to work on the expansion of this project. The local administration supports our ideas, and we may have plans for 2 more such buildings. There's one owner for this entire building. The procedures for renting out apartments is official, and the subsidies are made by the local government. There are several families that obtained housing here through local subsidies. The rest of the residents are employees of several local employers who subsidized these apartments and rented them out to their employees. Now, this is a modern house which has a parking space. It is important that this housing meets very high standards. The apartments are dry, warm, there is air conditioning, and the Velex system helps us ensure very healthy climate. Can we refrain from direct marketing? Well, this is not marketing. I'm explaining what we have in this building. Obviously, such apartments are very popular. We have a long waiting list, and we expect that our new buildings will be filled in very quickly. So as I said, we have plans for 2 more buildings. Right now, the land plot has already been purchased, and we are working on the documentation. So this experience shows that with the support of the local administration, a energy efficient rental house building is very profitable for investors. Thank you. Thank you. The administration took several apartments to rent them out, and how did they rent them out? So the administration subsidized rent in these apartments. And where do they get the money? How do they find it in the budget? Well, that's something that I have no idea about. What's the what's the rents right now? It's an average for the city. Can you give us some figures? I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't have the figures. 22,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment. And a studio would be, what, 18,000? This is a market price. What is the break-even period? Can you give us some figures? I think about 5 years. You mean 5 years? No, that's not possible. That's not possible. It's a small project, really. It's a small-scale project. And you bought the land? Did you get any loans? No. Do you have a question? Do you have a remark? Yes, I wanted to follow up on what the previous speaker said. Please. Questions, then. Questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, please. Please introduce yourself. Dear friends, I would suggest that we do not deceive ourselves here. This country does not have affordable housing, so we cannot use the World Bank and United Nations standards to calculate our averages. The whole world speaks in terms of median values. In this country, there's a great gap between the rich and the poor. In contrast to the European countries, according to unofficial statistics, this gap runs into some 20 orders of times. So we cannot really operate in averages. We can only operate in median values, and it's 70% less than elsewhere. So we run studies in all the Russian regions, and for your information, I represent the Russian Academy of Civil Service and Public Economy under the presidential administration. So at my academy, from all students, from bachelors and to PhD students, only use median values when they calculate. So incorporating gray income, only the 10th decile group can afford housing in Russia. If we take the entire housing stock, and Nadezhda made a beautiful presentation on this, I would like to add to it that among private houses, 25% of houses cannot be considered standard housing. It's clearly substandard. It doesn't have sanitation facilities inside. And the housing stock which was constructed in the Soviet times is highly depreciated. It is really run down. I would like to say that the luxury real estate, luxury housing that is mostly built in Moscow accounts, in terms of its area, less than 2% of the total housing stock. However, in terms of its price, it accounts for more than 10%. This is because Moscow is a state within a state. It is home to some of the wealthiest Russian families. This is why the Moscow market should really be factored out of the equation if we want to illustrate Russian trends. The capacity to meet the housing needs of waiting list families in a market economy is simply non-existent. The only way out here is rental housing. There is an excellent program in Moscow where families get a 5-year lease contract for municipal housing. Every 5 years, the contract is renewed. They pay 4,000 rubles monthly, and that includes all utilities. All utilities are provided in accordance with the general standards. This is a fairly effective program. Currently, I have 4 master's students in my department working on some 20 different options to attract investors through housing, using the system of housing certificates into this business. We're going to share all those findings publicly very soon. It will be available on our website. By the end of May, I will provide them to FIABCI in English. I can give you a short presentation, by the way, looking at the history of social housing in Russia from the pre-revolutionary times and to now. Yeah, so you will make this presentation available, so it will be accessible by the participants. Very good. And Nadezhda and I work really closely together. So there are lots of issues, dear friends. Every day brings one proposal for a solution, lots of different options, and I hope that we will be able to find the correct formulas even before the new legislation is enacted. Thank you very much, Irina. We did not plan for this presentation to be delivered, and I'm glad that we are more or less on the same page. And some of the really important points are the length of the duration of the contract and the rental fee, and rent control guarantees, really. But the question still remains: where do we get those homes from? Yesterday, together with Mr. Amann, we spent about an hour trying to compare our notes, and as far as the duration of the contract and guaranteed rent control, we said that, yes, these are 2 important prerequisites. Mr. Sharapov, do you have a question? Or maybe you? Okay. Is it on? I have a question addressed to Nadezhda Kosareva. One remark that you said was that in Russia, a person who is not a property owner considers himself or herself homeless. Perhaps it is the other way around. It is the state that considers such a person a homeless person. It's not the person, it's himself. Because a lot of civil liberties, a lot of rights and entitlements are tied to home ownership. If you want to get a travel passport, medical insurance, you need what's called domicile registration, right? You want to send your child to a school, you want to get access to some social services, they will ask you for your residential registration. Do you think that rental housing can really get underway unless we overcome this registration issue? 3 points here. Number 1, obviously, residential registration is a remnant of the Soviet times. However, I think it would be erroneous to say that registration is tied to home ownership. Registration is tied to permanent residence at a specific address, and your tenure doesn't matter. It may be a long-term lease, it may be a title, or it may be just a situation where the owner lets you in for several days and you can get a registration. But yes, I do agree that this is a horrible legacy and a great impediment indeed. I know about the link between the rights and residential legislation. However, when you ask whether it's the individual or the state that considers that individual homeless person, I believe that it's both. People are very conservative in terms of changing their thinking. You see, back in the Soviet days, people who lacked housing were put on the waiting list. And this logic still continues, it still persists. If you don't have a social lease contract with the municipality, you don't own a home, the state considers you to be a homeless person, and they put you on the waiting list. And I think the same works for the individual. The same logic persists individually. If you are renting a home, for instance, you are a military person, you are provided a subsidy for rent. to rent house for the period of his or her service, and that military person will tell you, we are in a very disadvantaged position because other people are allocated flats, they're given housing certificates, and I have to continue renting from this old lady that rents her flat out to me. So I think we need to stimulate some new type demand here. If we want to have rental housing, we need to stimulate demand for it.
Dr. Lim from Singapore. We have been hearing practices, in Europe. I was just wondering whether you like to listen to what we do back home in Singapore. I think the thing here is you need a political will to start with. Back in 1965, when Singapore was become independent, 35% of the housing are without sewerage. It's a very poor country. But over the number of years, some 40, 50 years now, if any one of you have visited Singapore, you know that about 82% of the population stay in public housing, or what you call social housing. How do we do it? When we first started, there is a political will. The leaders make it a point that it's a political point, in fact, want to have every Singapore citizen to have a home of their own. So what they do is they establish a very efficient housing authority, given the full powers to acquire land, to construct building, and to manage it. And they also work out a financial mechanism. We have what you call a retirement fund, but we allow some of the retirement fund to be used to purchase housing. And our social housing is both for rental as well as for full payment. That means owner occupation, full payment. Now, and we also have set up a mechanism to manage the house, because one of the things that we have not talked about is the maintenance. You can provide a house, but who's going to maintain the house? So these are some of those things that I think we've done. And although, of course, Singapore is a small country, but I somehow feel that the basic principles organization remain the same. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, my name is Solomon Enitan. I'm from Nigeria. And my country is an African country, and we have faced quite a bit of challenge with respect to housing. However, we have been able to surmount some of our challenges. And when I say challenges, I mean they are deep challenges. Now, one thing needs to be done. You need to clarify what you are looking for: affordable housing or social housing. Because the two are not the same. Affordable housing tracks home ownership. Affordable housing is interested in home ownership. And social housing looks at the two. People have rental housing. Some people want share of ownership. Some people want total ownership. So you have to define what you're targeting. If we're looking at social housing, I would want to take the example of the lady you showed in the family that you showed us. The income of that family, by my assessment, my quick assessment, was about 456,000 rubles per annum. That family can afford to own a home. Because they can own a home, they can own a $50,000 home, and if the Russian government creates, I like what my colleague from Singapore said about the political will. If the government creates a housing trust fund and you ask employees of, all paid employees to pay a 2.5% deposit out of their income into a housing fund, you would have, in 2 years, they would have contributed about 60% of their annual income. That will be sufficient deposit for people who need home ownership. So there are a lot of strategies that the government can employ, but you need to look at what you really want to focus on. Is it affordable homes? And I think affordable homes will be a good target for the Russian economy. If you look at your paid employed population, you will be able to identify how much in terms of a fund you can put together. Because most governments today, I sit on the Council for the Real Estate Developers Association in Nigeria, most governments today, they don't want to put their income into social housing. Neither is the World Bank wanting to do a project that is not going to be sustainable. So we must look at a sustainable project that will pay itself. You were asking where are the houses going to come from? The houses are going to come from the funds that are created, and employees can actually provide these funds. Thank you.
Thank you. Мы сразу хотели бы уточнить. Отличная.
Thank you very much. This is a brilliant remark. But let me tell you that St. Petersburg does not have a single housing unit available on the market that would cost about $50,000. Perhaps in other places in Russia, but not in St. Petersburg. Second remark. Today, the Russian state has certain commitments before its citizens, including the commitment, the obligation to provide free of charge housing. Yes, many people recognize that these are outdated commitments. However, they're still in force. And no active politician will never publicly denounce these commitments. Nobody will say, we promised this, we cannot keep our promise. Because in that case, they will need to explain why is it that we're having an the Olympic Games? Why is it that we're having these large-scale, ambitious projects? This is why the situation is stagnating. And this is why the government is starting developing slowly, very small benefits in exchange for the right to free housing. This is a process that is still going very slowly. And I understand your approach. It is very clear to me. Nobody wants to spend money on social housing. I understand this. So thank you. And Mr. Mulligan, please.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today with many experts on social housing. Actually, one of our moderators, Wolfgang Amann, is a colleague of mine. He works at the Real Estate Market Advisory Group, which advises us in the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. I work in the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe in the Housing and Land Management Unit. One of the activities that we've been involved in is organizing roundtable discussions to discuss real estate best practices around Europe. Our most recent such discussion was in Moscow, January 2012. This was a working group. It was organized with the World Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and the Russian government. And the panelists in that roundtable discussion, one of the recommendations they made was to establish a working group on social housing. So this is an issue that we're very aware of in my unit. Well, I said I would be brief, and I was, so thank you.
Thank you. Коллеги, на сегодняшний день надо просто моделировать, и мы такие модели построили, и смотреть доход... Шарапов Александр, президент FIABCI Россия, и смотреть доходность, которую на сегодняшний день устраивает инвесторов при инвестициях в недвижимость. 10% – это то, что их может устроить. Теперь семья конкретно. Первое – это доходность для инвестора. Второе – это спрос, который на сегодняшний день есть. И на сегодняшний день, в том числе, спрос, да, во многом связан с тем, что люди...
Today, demand is mostly... Okay, there are lots of factors in the demand here, and another factor is how much interest do the municipalities have. If a municipality has a building on their books today, they have to provide subsidies for the maintenance of that house, because they need to do landscaping and maintenance. Today, the rates for such services are so low, and their budgets are so low that they really need, the rental fees are so low that they need to provide subsidies. Let me also talk about the situation of Russian families. That particular family earns 38,000 rubles every month. According to international standards, they can spend about 30%, not more, on housing every month, and that is 12,000 rubles. Dmitry is right. 60,000 rubles is the cost of 1 square meter in an apartment by month. So it's just unrealistic for them. Out of the 60,000, is this a big share is the so-called land rent, and some other important components include utilities. About half of that, about 30K is construction costs, and 30K is another 30K is what we call the land rent or the land fee. I think Kingisepp is a very good example of this. Rostro has been able to build a house, and they have gotten very close to the 12K rubles. So rather than paying 40K per apartment a month, the residents will be paying 20K, and the government will be co-paying here. So I think you really need to do some modeling, exploring different scenarios and different options for different regions. And in some places you will be successful. It worked in Kaluga, it worked in Novosibirsk. Several houses are being built in St. Petersburg. It's just a matter of having more incentives from the government. I was surprised to see the 3% yield in Germany at one of the exhibition stands. The average profit in commercial apartment block is about 7% profit, and if this is being funded by the state, it's 5%, because this is long-term. Because it's a long-term lease contract, and investors are prepared to face lower yields.
A co-moderator and president in Nigeria. It's not actually a question, but a suggestion. We quite appreciate most of the presentations, but I'm sure many of us who don't speak Russian, we lost substantial part of the presentation. So my suggestion is whether those that were written in Russia could be translated into English and be posted to the website of FIABCI, so that those of us who couldn't follow you by reading, we have access to it. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Да, разумеется, это будет сделано.
Oh, yes, indeed, will do. On behalf of the organizers, I can promise to you that this will be done, and my colleague here also confirms this. Please, another question or comment? Dear participants, I'm Igor Lebedev. I am in charge of an expert group of the national agency. The issue that we're discussing here today is really very, very relevant, and we have heard about several solutions being proposed. We discussed certain figures today. I believe that some of the figures that were put forward are really a little bit of wishful thinking. We cannot say that we can be realistic about providing 22 square meters per individual to every family. We cannot talk about reaching incomes of about 40,000 rubles a month. I think the main challenge that we're facing in this country today, this is a stumbling block really that we need to resolve somehow. I'm talking about the need to urgently change the legislation. We have heard about some of the regulatory improvements underway currently, but this needs to be a massive effort, and there needs to be a wide-ranging media campaign in order to raise the awareness and change the attitudes of the population, because without changing their mentality, we won't be able to successfully address these housing needs effectively in this country. And I think I will allow myself to take 1 minute to discuss that horrible flat that we saw. That family lives in the area where I live. I know where that building is, and my office is nearby. But this is what is called a very fashionable and elite district. Why is it possible to have such housing in such a place? it has to do with people's mentality. I got this free of charge, and the government still owns me. I'm not going to invest. I'm only going to take, not to give. Can you imagine a European saying anything like this? Because a European will work for when they're really underpaid, but they will invest whatever they have into improving their conditions. Russians will not readily do that. So I think the mentality issue seems to be the central issue here. We need to change the situation around in terms of people's thinking. And this applies to social housing, not-for-profit housing as it is understood around the world. Now, I think you are speaking in myths here. Let me tell you, this apartment is not sellable. 2 agencies tried to sell it. It didn't work. I hope you're not saying I'm telling you lies. No, the price is clear. We know how much they need to improve their living conditions, their housing conditions. It's just there is no source of funding. There's no source of money available. Dear friends, I think we'll understand that one solution to the housing problem is to introduce the possibility of rental housing. And rental housing is practically non-existent in Russia, except for the grey market that Nadezhda talked about. I think we should give the floor to Wolfgang Amann now, who is in charge of this working group, because I'm a business person. I have business thinking, and when I looked at their project, I asked myself, how will the investors become involved in this? Why would they be motivated? What developer will build something under these conditions? It's much easier to build commercial housing and sell it right away, and then build another one, and so on. But when I looked deeper into the problem, I understood that these mechanisms can work when there is a strong political will on the part of the government, when there are discounts or land allocations, long-term loans through a housing agency or housing authority, but on the very strict condition that whatever income is derived from rent can only be reinvested into more housing construction and maintenance. In that case, the investor will have confidence. They know where they are investing, and this is a long-term guaranteed investment. Many investors would be motivated to pursue that. So let us hear from the person who knows about this problem and these solutions very well.
Thank you very much. I have the pleasure to round up this challenging round table and to give you a vision how affordable rental housing in Russia could possibly work. Okay. I'm a member of the Real Estate Market Advisory Group of the United Nations. It was introduced already. This Real Estate Market Advisory Group has published a guideline, a policy framework for sustainable real estate markets. And we have listed several principles, altogether some 10. One of them is social housing as an integrative part of real estate markets. Please understand that there is the necessity to distinguish between terms. When I talk about social housing, it means actually affordable rental housing. It is not the same what is usually understood in Russia with social housing, which is actually housing free of charge as a present to the beneficiary households. This is not what we are talking about. We are talking about affordable rental housing for lower and middle income groups. It is not only for the poor, but it is for normal households as the one we have seen with an income of 40,000 ruble. That's a moderate income household which should be able to afford decent housing. We had already heard quite comprehensive information about the current situation of the housing situation in Russia. I do not want to repeat, only let me highlight on some issues which have not been mentioned so far. One is that there is a heavy pressure on the metropolitan areas. Russia has great problems with the monocities, with millions of people wanting to come to Moscow and St. Petersburg who are restricted to come to these areas. Actually, this barriers to migration is a barrier for economic development of Russia. So with a comprehensive scheme of housing provision, you could contribute substantially to improve preconditions of economic development of your country. We have heard about the floor space per capita, which is roughly half of EU average. And I think EU average should be the benchmark for Russia, isn't it? We have a deteriorating housing stock. We have an underdeveloped financing sector. This has to be committed frankly. The outstanding housing loans in percentage of GDP is only 3.2% in Russia. It is more than tenfold. It's 15 times this level in the average of the European Union. It's 52%. And in some countries, for example in the Netherlands, it is above 100% of GDP. That is to say, with promotion of housing finance, both for purchasing of owner-occupied housing and of financing of rental housing, is a very, very strong leverage to increase the housing situation in Russia and to move forward with the economic development. We have a very high interest rates in our Russian mortgage system. It is about 12% interest rate per year. In the Eurozone, by comparison, we have interest rates of only 3%. This makes, of course, a huge difference in financing housing and making housing affordable. We have heard about the unaffordability problem. We have not heard so far too much about the low mobility in Russia. So the rate of changes of living place, the rate of people moving to the place where they find a job is very low in Russia. Again, an issue, an argument where housing issues is closely linked with economic issues. So we altogether can say that the housing sector, barriers in the housing sector, is a major barrier of economic development in Russia. Even though the rental housing stock in Russia is substantial, we still have some 27% of rental housing. And good news, new construction of housing actually is on a substantial level. I was quite surprised when I saw these numbers, that with more than 700,000 completions in the year 2010, you have reached a level of 5.1 completions per 1,000 inhabitants. This is some 50% above the EU average. That is to say, housing construction in principle works, the construction industry in principle is doing a good job, but there is quite a serious mismatch between what is needed and what is produced. Produced is primarily owner-occupied housing in a metropolitan area. There is almost no rental housing construction. We heard already about this. And of course, we have a very serious backlog in housing provision. So the government has decided to increase the necessary rate of new construction to about 10 completions per 1 year within the next few years. Russia has a massive production of social housing even, but in this very strange scheme of producing new accommodation and give it for free to people. This is a system which cannot be sustainable, that's self-understanding. And the question of waiting lists, which we have heard already frequently in our session, is for apartments free of charge. I mean, where do we live, that we are waiting for apartments for free and are willing to wait for 30 years or whatever to put our children after birth to such a list, to have a chance to have an apartment once they marry 30 years later. I think it's a very rational decision of the government to introduce a new scheme of rental, of affordable rental housing in Russia. This is a way to modernize the whole system and to approach European standards in housing legislation and housing provision. I want to show you a model which could be the future of rental housing in Russia. It is quite clear that there is plenty of possible solutions. We have heard about the housing scheme in Singapore, which is indeed a very good one, a very successful one. We have housing schemes from the United States. We have housing schemes from Great Britain, from France. I will show you a housing scheme which derives from my very thorough knowledge of the Austrian system of affordable housing. It is not exactly about the Austrian system. It is very much about how housing, affordable rental housing, could work for Russia in the future. So what you see here is images of social housing in Austria. Obviously, it is not only a question of financing, it is not only a question of the legal framework, but it is very much a question of the institutional setting. You need organizations which realize this kind of apartments. Quite clear, it can be done by the public. There are solutions where the public is quite quite an efficient housing developer, but if the public is doing this by itself, we definitely will have a problem with control. Of course, it's possible that the commercial sector is doing housing in this quality, but very probably, if the commercial sector is doing this with, for example, demand-side subsidies, we will probably have a problem with increasing prices, with price inflation, and with growing demand of demand-side subsidies. That is to say, in the long run, it will be a rather costly model. What I will propose to you is a PPP model, that is, that the starting point is an institutional setting. We create a business case which differs from the business case of commercial housing developers active in Russia so far, which is not public housing, but which is a model where state obligation for the provision of housing is combined with allocation schemes, with efficiency requirements of private market. It is a PPP model which takes the best from public support and private market efficiency. The performance of the PPP housing sector in Austria, please imagine, this could be Russia in about 15 years. It's only a question of a political decision. The sector has a stock of 820,000 units. This is 23% of the total housing stock in Austria, which mainly was built up within the last 40 years. The number of new construction is about 15 to 20,000 units per year, with which they are a major player in new construction. It is about 1/3 of total housing construction, and it is more than 50% of multi-apartment housing construction. At the same time, this sector has an impressively high refurbishment rate. It has legal regulations that allows them to accumulate funds from their tenants, that allows them to refurbish every building within a cycle of about 25 years all around. With this refurbishment rate, the sector has the best energy performance of all the sectors in Austrian housing sector. It is a front-runner in low energy and zero energy standard. In Vienna, for example, we have already 25% of new construction in passive house standard. That is to say, these are buildings which do not require conventional heating. They have very thick wall insulation, they have 3-layer glass, they have a ventilation system, so they do not need any additional heating anymore. That is obviously the future of energy provision and avoidance of climate change. And the most important issue is the social targeting of the sector. Altogether, we have a housing cost ratio in Austria of only 17.6%, which is about 5% points below EU average. And even in the rental housing sector, the housing cost ratio is only slightly above 20%. An average household, and we can talk about average or median, that's not really the topic we are talking about. The average household has to pay not more than 24–25% of its income for a decent apartment of 70, 80, 90 square meters. The average floor space per capita in Austria is 43 square meters. Of course, this is very much driven by single-family homes, but in the multi-apartment, in the social housing sector, the average size of dwellings is about 80 square meters. These companies have developed two quite financially mature institutions. The total assets of the sector, I mixed it a little bit. This dot in the first line should be after the 9. The total assets of the sector is already 39 billion euro. 39 billion euro of assets. Yearly construction volume is 2.5 billion euro. How is this possible to build up such huge assets? The companies are allowed to have precisely defined income components by developing these housing venues. It is altogether about 10% of the construction costs. Additionally, for own equity invested in these housing projects, they can ask a return on own equity which is quite low, only some 4 to 5%. This is limited. But the invested own equity is actually not too high. They reinvest all the earnings which they make, but the starting point of these institutions is actually with a rather small amount of investors' capital. Quite important, and one of the main issues which I want to bring to your attention is a strict scheme of audit and control. This obligation goes far beyond to a company listed at the stock exchange. The auditing association sits in these companies every year for 3 or 4 weeks and checks not only the financial conduct, not only the balance sheet and the financial statement, but all issues of financial conduct, including the incomes of the management, including the cars they drive, and all these issues. If they do not comply with the regulations, they get cited, and if they do not remove the bad behavior, they will be excluded from future subsidies, and the final sanction actually is that they will be excluded from this whole system, from this whole scheme. The owner of such companies gets back only the invested capital, which he had from the very beginning, plus a yearly return of 3.5%. So the sanction is very efficient, and it works quite well in this respect. State subsidies given to these companies do not only lower the costs for the beneficiaries, but they are some kind of an implicit guarantee for these companies. The banks treat these companies quite different to commercial institutions because of these subsidies, because they understand that these institutions are controlled very efficiently. Additionally, the subsidies in many cases are securitized in the second rank. That is to say, subsidies may work as a kind of own equity of these companies. For this reason, it is possible that these institutions finance their projects on much better conditions than usual commercial developers. Due to their size and due to the regulation schemes and due to public subsidies, these institutions get quite a lot of market power towards construction costs and financing services. They have the best conditions on the financial markets. At the same time, the financing industries, the Austrian banks, are very happy to finance these institutions because of their very, very good rating. Principles of PPP housing as we envisage it for Russia might be and are today for Austria a legally defined business model providing state obligations with market mechanisms. Such organizations might be owned by municipalities. This is a self-understanding institutional setting, but I strongly recommend that also the private sector should be allowed to own such limited or non-profit organizations. Housing provision is based on the principle of cost coverage with legally defined income components. We are able to reduce risks of such institutions by this legal and financial framework. And if we reduce the risk, it is possible to work efficiently and sustainably with a return on investment with 4 or 5% instead of 20, 30 or 40%. So reducing the risk, the implicit risk of business development is even more efficient measure to break down the costs than financing or construction costs. So working with the risks, reducing the risks of this sector is actually the key. Tie-up of assets, that means particularly if private institutions and individuals are owners of such institutions, it's quite a clear thing that in the long run there will be a huge pressure to cash out the assets which are accumulated in such institutions. So we need tight legal framework that does not allow individuals, the owners, to cash out the assets which are accumulated. Profits are an important driver of business conduct, and this is the same with this sector as well. But the profits should be or must be reinvested in affordable housing. Even though there is quite a rationale for private owners to have some institutions, to run some such institutions. When I have discussed this issue with my friends and colleagues before my presentation, I had the following picture. Imagine a successful entrepreneur who has built up a construction and housing development company which has assets of 1 billion euro, which is his private property and which is a for-profit company. 1 billion euro. At the same time, he has built up a limited or non-profit housing organization with assets of 1 billion euro. So obviously, the 1 billion euro of the non-profit organization has a value to this owner which is more than zero, even though he cannot cash it out, even though he cannot take the money and take it to Switzerland, or cannot take this money, sell the company and use this 1 billion euro to buy property in Japan or whatever. Obviously, the value is more than zero. It has an economic value, but it also has non-economic values. He can do something for the country. He can do something for its clientele. For example, if trade unions are owners of such organizations, it's quite clear they serve their clients, they serve their members. So obviously the value of such an organization, even though it is not possible to cash it out, is more than zero. Maybe it's even more than 1 billion euro. Under some circumstances, it is thinkable that the value of such an institution is even higher than of a profit-oriented organization. To create the PPP housing sector is actually connected with the creation of a business case, and it is a give and take basis. The public gives land and infrastructure free of charge, for example, or at low costs. It gives a financing model, including soft loans or grants or whatever. In projects in other countries, we try to acquire long-term financing of 5%. That's sufficient to provide affordable rental housing without additional subsidies. Again, it is a take. So the public gives money, gives legal regulation, and it takes restricted rents. It asks from the owner limited profits. It asks from the owner tie-up of the assets. It obliges strict audit and control, and it applies sanctions. Long-term stakes in affordable rental housing are obvious for the public, and I hope that I have convinced you that they are obvious for the private owners as well. The model creates huge benefits in a long perspective, and I think that's quite a remarkable aspect of the model. It might be a contribution to change the business conduct in Russia from a very short-term oriented business model to a long-term oriented business model. So my recommendation, PPP housing converts non-marketable housing provision to a business case. I wish you good luck in the introduction of such a sector in Russia. I hope very much that Russia will decide to include the private sector to solve this challenge, because the private sector is one of the most efficient driving forces of civil society development in this country. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, доктор Amann.
Thank you very much. And a few concluding remarks. Recently, we had a very interesting story in St. Petersburg. 10 years ago, a policeman was hiding, waiting for someone to break into the apartment. And this policeman remained in that apartment. He lived there for 10 years, and he decided then to register this apartment as his own. You all have a reference material on St. Petersburg, but you will find a lot of different figures there, but you will never find anything about the amount of housing that becomes available every year. We have a lot of houses near the new bridge that was built in St. Petersburg that officially has been taken out of housing stock, but we have people living there. They pay rent. Who do they pay this rent to? We have heard that the political will is necessary here, and I think, unfortunately, the political will is something that we expect to arrive out of the blue. We used to put our hopes on the market, but now we are waiting for the political will. I think the first step to make is to register what we have, to take the stock, to understand how much housing we have in St. Petersburg, because the housing figures do not take into account the second homes or dachas. 2.5 million residents of St. Petersburg formerly have land plots or summer houses. So we need to inventorize what we already have, make the first steps, and move forward. The government today says, we can't tell you anything. You can wait for a long time. But people should not sit there waiting. They should make a first step. Let the government do a little bit for these people, and let the people make the first step to meet the government halfway. There are ways to resolve this problem. This is not a zero-sum game. This is a win-win situation, both for the residents and the government. And we heard many speakers say that today. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, speakers. I think we had a very interesting roundtable discussion. We heard different opinions, different approaches, different models. We can see that different countries try to approach this issue from different perspectives. Mikhail said that this is a very topical issue, that there are discussions held at the State Duma, there are local discussions, and local legislative assemblies are very much on this topic. I think it is important that the proposals that were formulated here were not lost. We don't want the proposals to be lost, as it usually happens. Working groups formulate their recommendations, they introduce them into bills, and the government changes the bill so that nothing remains out of those recommendations. We want the market players to participate in these discussions. This is not an issue that can be solved by one party alone. We have to involve all the participants. I think that we will be able to solve this problem only when there are moves from all the participants, not only the construction companies, who will definitely find advantages, not only to those factories who would be interested in such programs because they would be supplying materials. These are the programs that would be interesting to businessmen, to investors who want to get back a stable income. And I'm sure that we could use the Western experience here to great advantage. We have true experts in the bond panel today, people who play a lead role in this development. The AHML is a structure that Andrey represents, a structure that is the only organization that can give you a long-term loan on the conditions that would be of interest to developers. We have Nadezhda Borisovna, who is the only professional institution in the country that is able to offer realistic programs and realistic recommendations that could be taken as amendments into various legislation. And as far as I understand, the legislature is very much interested in getting these recommendations, although in the end they are never followed. Let's do everything in our power in order for these recommendations to be heard. And we know that Andrey heads a whole agency that is supposed to implement such recommendations. We'll basically have a working group, and Alexander is part of it. I really want to have someone from the global community to be included in this working group. Wolfgang Amann is a person who's been working in this area for a long, long time, and I would welcome his participation in this effort in Russia. So we have 15 copies of the recommendations developed by FIABCI and by Wolfgang Amann, who is the head of this working group. We have 15 copies in Russian, we have 15 copies in English. I think it is important for us to follow up on these recommendations. Let us not reinvent the wheel. And I understand that it will require additional effort. It will require additional time. But we may get some results in 10 to 15 years. We may have 10 to 15% of social housing in Russia. But we're not talking St. Petersburg alone. We're talking about the entire country of Russia. But you have to understand that the rent rates in social housing abroad are 20% below the market rate. And that obviously gives a great impetus to the development of the market. I'd like to thank all the participants in this roundtable discussion. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you for your discussions. Thank you for coming from so far away. I appreciate your participation. I am confident that people who have gathered together here in this room can contribute to the development of the situation. Often people say that things are being solved in Moscow, that decisions are being made in Moscow, and we can't do anything. This is what makes us different from the Americans, for instance. As you know, the Americans participate in the elections, just like the French, for instance. They know that they are changing something in their lives. I think it is time for us to change things in our lives, because otherwise we will never make this first step. The government is prepared to follow us. Let me give you an example. 2007, when I was the president of the Russian Guild of Realtors, we had a meeting on affordable housing, and I told President Medvedev that we had to build affordable housing. And President Medvedev told me that affordable housing does not meet the mentality of Russian residents. So we will have to build housing that will be later owned by residents. 10 years have, almost 6 years have passed. Now the mentality has changed in the government. Let's capitalize on this situation, and I think all of us here can contribute to that. Thank you.